that. All right, great. Let's go ahead and resume. All right, so for the next next hour probably or so, we're going to go ahead and have a roundtable. And this roundtable is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, the quest for accountability. And I am particularly excited about this roundtable discussion because these are my people. So they know that I have a little selfish reason for organizing this roundtable because all of us were involved in the very first case that was brought, constitutional law case for restitution for the victims of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. This is 20 years ago when we brought that case. Many of us have gray hair now. We look different, right? 20 years ago, we were baby lawyers and we were on fire. We were doing a lot of different things. So sort of fast forward, it's a little bit of a reunion for us to have the opportunity to kind of connect and reflect a little bit about what we did, what we were able to accomplish, what we were not able to accomplish, what the law does and doesn't do, and then some folks, and I think maybe everybody on this panel is continuing to do that work. So there is, in fact, another case that's out there that is based on state law claims, not the Constitution, and so the fight continues. But let me go ahead and introduce our panelists for today and sort of how they intersect with this topic, and then share for some of you who may not be that familiar with the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, what it was, what happened, and what was some of the efforts that we made initially to try to get restitution for our clients. So I'll just start in the order in which we're at the table here. My friend and colleague, Adjoa Aiyetoro, is Professor Emeritus of Law at William H. Bowen School of Law at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. And she has been working domestically, she's been working internationally to get remedies for historical and present day wrongs for a long time. So she's been in the trenches here. Just a couple of things. She's a lifetime member of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and was their chairperson of the board and their national director. Also co-chair and founding member of NCOBRA, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. And as you heard earlier, she's working on this issue of related reparations in Georgetown. So we are thrilled to have you, Adjoa. Also, my friend and colleague, Eric Miller, who's a professor and the Leo J. O'Brien Fellow at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And he is an expert in legal theory, reparations, and policing. Again, he's also internationally recognized expert on reparations for Black people in the United States. He's testified numerous times before the House on a variety of bills that have been pushed, whether it's statutes of limitations or whether it's just studying reparations and the possibility, the slavery reparations. He has testified before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights on reparations for slavery and structural discrimination. He's a member of the Reparations Coordinating Committee. And as I mentioned, took the leading role in drafting the complaint for that initial lawsuit. And so I remember that fondly, that, editing that thing, working on that and, just flying by the seat of our pants in some ways, trying to come up with some things there. But now actually has a really, is one of the lead attorneys in a new case now, which is a public nuisance case, Randall versus City of Tulsa. So we'll be able to learn a little bit more about those current efforts. And then finally, Pastor Robert Turner. Robert and I go way back to University of Alabama. So where I first cut my teeth as a law professor. So I had the pleasure of meeting Robert back then. And he is the pastor currently of Empowerment Temple AME in Baltimore. But he was the pastor of the historic Vernon AME Church in Tulsa. Really, it was the only building that survived, right? The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. So has been just a force in Tulsa in terms of bringing the community together and moving forward. He is now the academic dean for Jackson Theological Seminary in Little Rock, Arkansas, and is on the National African American Reparations Commission. So really, really excited to get the gang back together again. So I want to talk a little bit about the initial litigation that we brought, and then also just the case itself. If we go back to, well, we'll go back, it's about 100 years, right? Going back 100 years here. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. This was May 31st. And for those of you who don't know that history, we know that the city of Greenwood was the African-American section of Tulsa, and one of the most prosperous African-American communities at the time. In fact, so successful, it was called the Black Wall Street or the Negro Wall Street. And this conflict started, as many conflicts do, or back at that time during Reconstruction in the South, but not just in the South, where you had a young African-American male who was accused of assaulting a young white female. And this was Dick Rowland. He was literally going into a government building, I think, looking for a bathroom, right? If we think about what life was like back then in terms of segregation, you can't just go to the bathroom anywhere, right? You have to find one for coloreds. So he went into this building, some kind of altercation took place in the elevator, and so he was thrown into jail, and this was near the local courthouse. And so there was a white mob that started to form on the outside of the courthouse, and there was a rumor that was circulating that he would probably be lynched, right? So that threat, the idea of being lynched, is that was not a light-hearted rumor that was circulating. That was probably exactly what his fate was going to be. During this time period, this is what we think of as the lynching era. So the lynching era from 1880 to 1930, we had untold brutality against African Americans. Beatings, murder, rape, lynchings, that was kind of the standard operating procedure in terms of the notion of keeping Black people in their place. We know that in 1921, 59 African Americans were lynched in the southern and border states. But make no mistake, this is not just a southern thing. So from 1911 to 1921, we had 23 African Americans who were lynched in Oklahoma alone. So this was not sort of an idle threat. I'll give you one example, which is particularly egregious, but and this made a postcard. There was a famous postcard that was going around that people made a lot of money off of this postcard, but it was same sort of story. It was a Black mom and her son were accused of some kind of crime, were thrown into the local jail. There was a mob of about 40 white men who came and dragged them out, raped her first, and then gagged and lynched them both. And so there's a famous postcard of all of these people sort of on a bridge gawking at these two bodies that are hanging. So this is just, this is real, right? This is what was happening at that time period. So this is very, very frightening. So the folks that came to the defense, right, this mob started to form, there was a gunshot that went off, and ultimately there was a massacre, right? There were about 300 people killed, maybe, thousands of people left homeless, everything razed to the ground, right? Public schools, churches, homes, you name it. And the folks that came to their defense were Black veterans, right? People had just gotten back home, who didn't get the benefit of the GI Bill, right? Didn't get any of the sort of like accolades that you would expect veterans, were the people who were actually fighting for their fellow citizens. So within a 24-hour period, you have the entire Black community destroyed. When I think of this, like, it kind of reminds me of what's going on in Ukraine. Like, oh yeah, okay, there's a massacre, right? Literally, you take out an entire group of people overnight, you destroy their entire lives. Wow, yeah, that sounds like a lot like what we're talking about here when we think about these racial massacres. I wish I could say that they were unique, but Tulsa's an example of one of a number of these massacres that occurred during this time period. And so what we learned is that during this massacre, the government, in fact, deputized and armed white citizens to go after their fellow Black citizens, right? And they were literally given the authority and given instructions to go get a gun and go get an N word, right? And so this is what happened. That mob was unleashed on innocent men, women, and children, and completely destroyed this community in a 24-hour period of time. You know, this was condemned as one of, you know, nationwide as one of the worst racial massacres, and, you know, reparations and restitution were promised, but none ever came. So as you can imagine, in the midst of this, many people were completely destitute, homeless, terrorized, right? Again, think what's going on in Ukraine. We see these sort of terrible images of people's lives being completely upended and destroyed. The idea here, the expectation was that they needed to file, if they had a grievance, they had to file that lawsuit in a timely manner within 2 years, right? So you're given a 2-year statute of limitations to put it together and get a lawsuit filed. God bless them, some of them did, right? I mean, it was unbelievable. So B.C. Franklin, who was the father of John Hope Franklin, the historian, the sort of renowned historian at the time, B.C. Franklin was a renowned lawyer in Tulsa, who in fact did erect, he had a tent out in the middle of the rubble, and he tried to bring lawsuits, at least against the insurance companies, to get, bring claims for property damage and life, things of that nature. But most people who were at that time were not successful. The people who did, in fact, try to bring some types of claims could not, right? And so because you have law enforcement, you have a system that is infected by the Ku Klux Klan from top to bottom, right? There was literally no way to use the legal system. Not only that, we know that information was buried, litigation was discouraged, there were making it really impossible to create a record in order to prevail. And there were victims that were buried in unmarked graves. Again, we're sort of seeing some of that in Ukraine, right? So it definitely registers there. And the government failed to prosecute anybody or investigate the perpetrators. So not a single criminal act has ever been prosecuted by the government for murder, for arson, for assault. And in fact, the Greenwood community was in fact initially blamed in the local press for what had happened. So we have all this evidence that is buried, no talk about what's going on here. That suppression was so effective that even the mayor of Tulsa, right, when there was the commission report, started to do some investigation, had no idea it even happened. This was in 1996. Didn't even know about it. Wasn't in the history books. So none of that was made available here. So that's the kind of environment that the court system is asking people to navigate and use to bring a litigation. So fast forward 80 years later, there is a commission that does a full investigation, right? After this conspiracy of silence, they start to look in terms of what was going on. They do a study. It took them 4 years, and it wasn't until 2001 that this comes out, February 28th of 2001. And they comb all of these archives. You have historians, you have legal scholars, forensic specialists, archaeologists, anthropologists going through libraries and so forth, interviewing hundreds of survivors and witnesses. Eddie Fay Gates was part of our team, a renowned historian who provided so much of that documentation and that work. And ultimately, for the first time, after 4 years of that work, they have 20,000 pages of information that indicates that, yes, in fact, the government was involved. They deputized, they authorized, they armed white citizens to attack Black citizens, right? Here, their own sort of massacre on US soil. And what they said was the government took moral culpability. They didn't take legal culpability, but they took moral culpability for what had happened, promised restitution, but again, it never came. This is where we come in. So then we decided, right, and I will say we were part of a team of giants. I didn't decide. Charles Ogletree from Harvard. We had Johnny Cochran, and I know for young, he was not in the forefront. Let me hold that back, rolling it back. Okay, stand corrected. And I will stand corrected by Adjoa, trust me. I won't get away with anything. All right, so let's think. Eddie Fay Gates, Al Brophy, guys, Al Brophy. Okay, Al Brophy, Charles Ogletree. I am going to mention, we know he was in the mix. We were, obviously DeMario, who's not with us. We had a panelist today who couldn't make it, unfortunately, but he was in the mix. John Hope Franklin, okay? He was in the mix. So we were part of an amazing team of people, right, who worked on this litigation and who made this happen. And, you know, household names and people you'd never hear of who were working very hard behind the scenes were basically, I would say, compelled to bring the litigation because we couldn't do it any other way, right, in terms of getting restitution for the victims. So here we are, armed with evidence we never had before. We represented over 130 survivors in the federal courts, claiming that the government had violated the Constitution and a number of federal statutes, right? Section 1983 claim. We've got the evidence for the first time that wasn't available before. So we were part of that team. The district court dismissed the case because of statutes of limitations. It acknowledged, I guess, in the opinion that this was a complex and serious situation. Having said that, it concluded that the statute of limitations had expired. We then took it up to the 10th Circuit, which affirmed the lower court decision. Then we tried to go for a hearing on bonk review, and that was denied. So basically the courts were telling us that it's just too late to bring this lawsuit, right? It's too late for justice to be done. So yeah, I mentioned we appealed, we went to the 10th Circuit. There was I had drafted a historian's brief on behalf of John Hope Franklin and Scott Ellsworth, who was part of our team. So this was the one case that I decided I was going to hold on to when I transitioned from being a lawyer to going into academia, right? Because I cared, this was the thing that kind of, I could not let this go, right? So this was like 6 years pro bono work, and it's the one thing that I cared about the most. And so I sort of held on, and I didn't know what to do, right? As a law professor, how am I going to be supportive? What am I going to do? I wrote a law review article. I'm like, what else do you do when you're a law review? Okay, let me see if that helps. And so I wrote about the statute of limitations, the underlying rationales for them and their exemptions, and why the court has the authority and should have exercised it here to toll the statute of limitations. What our team did is, after we had exhausted the federal route and the courts route, we went to the legislative route. And this is really a story of like kind of, if you don't win here, you go here. If that doesn't work, you try this and that. So that was kind of, this was our strategy. And so then there was the John Hope Franklin, the Tulsa Greenwood Race Riot Claims Accountability Act of 2007, trying to get the statute of limitations tolled for 5 years from the point of the act being enacted. That did not work. We were not successful, and we can talk more about why that was the case, but that did not prevail. We entered my article into the record. This was sort of see what happens. Ultimately, that was not, that didn't work. We went into international efforts, and here I think other folks can speak more to that, but Charles Ogletree and Gay McDougall from Global Rights then made arguments, right? Alleging violation of human rights, arguing that the US courts basically denied our victims an effective remedy in the court system. That was not successful. Then we went on an educational campaign, and we pretty much sort of traveled the country trying to tell people about the Tulsa Race Massacre, giving voice to our clients. There were a couple of documentaries that were done at the time. Terror in Tulsa by Art Fennell, in fact, got an Emmy for his work. And we just went across the country, Abyssinia Baptist Church, Temple Law School, churches, law schools, community groups, whoever would kind of hear us, to learn and uplift the voices of our clients and know what was going on. And then fast forward today, I'm really proud and excited that that journey continues, and Eric and Adjoa, I believe, are all three of you involved in the new case? Okay. Okay, all right, so Eric, Professor Miller will share a little bit more with us about that, and we had DeMario was going to join us and tell us about the current litigation. There's a new lawsuit, there's new legislation, really based on different types of state law claims where we don't have the same kind of statute of limitations problems. So I think, I sort of set up this scenario here just to let you know how we got here. And we're going to have a conversation about why this even happened to begin with. I think in terms of why did this take place? How do you address it? Can you address it? And so we are all going to take kind of a crack at that. And I'll turn it over to Professor Aiyetoro to give us some remarks and insights. So thank you.
I wasn't gonna.
Okay, am I on? Oh, good. Can hear me. Great. Well, first of all, I want to start off by saying why I objected to Johnny Cochran's name. Because everybody's sitting there saying, what is she saying? Because what happens in this case is the stars who do little work get recognition. And this is not a new thing. The first article that was published, you all remember, talked about the talented, I forget the name of it, and they talked about Johnny Cochran. I'm reading, I'm saying, Johnny Cochran. So that's why I object. I liked, he is now deceased, he's an ancestor. I liked Johnny Cochran. He did a lot of good work. But we have to stop the press from not acknowledging the people who do the work. And our stars they're ready to come forward and grin and smile, but the people who do the work don't get acknowledged. And to me, that is not only unfair to them, us, but it is also unfair to the people, because the people feel like you got to be some big shot in the news, headlines, in order to do the work. So that was my objection. All right, so, all right, thank you. Now, don't take that off my time. So I'm here to talk about what we, in our preparatory meetings, I said I wanted to talk about the real context of the why. Why is it that we had a Tulsa race massacre? Why is it that we had your book story, and I'm blanking on the guy, Collins' story? Why is it? Because I learned when I first went to the academy, I used to just say racism, but what I learned, and I fought against it because all our lives we're raised to think that race is real, right? That race is real. That in fact, there are significant differences between me and the white person, or seemingly white, because I taught my students, you can't just get gauged by a phenotype, because we know a whole lot of Black folks passed as being white, right? But I believe my family, I'm sure all of us celebrated race as real, right? I got into, when I first went into the academy as an old person, having been an activist for a long time, teacher, lawyer, and all of that stuff, social worker, all of that, I thought race was real until I started studying what? Critical race theory. And critical race theory teaches that race is what? A social construct. It's a social construct. The studies, and we were trying to figure out which one of his relatives, all these famous geniuses in the Higginbotham family, but there was a book written, and I'm not sure it was Evelyn, she was co-authored about this big, on race, and I can't remember the exact name of it, but in that book, she and her co-author talked about the founding of the racial hierarchy. Now we know that Derek Bell and others taught the racial hierarchy, but they didn't teach, I didn't read in Derek's book, maybe it was, how it was founded. So in this book, she talked about it. I can't remember if she gave the name, but I did a little preparation for today. And the person who started the racial hierarchy in scholarly and then has gotten expanded to all of us, right, was a German in Connecticut, I believe, but his background was German, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. all right? In the 16th century, he was studying differences of people. So because he was coming into contact with people who look like me, people who look, like Asians, and he created this racial hierarchy. So it is true. It is created. It is a social construct. But why? And what is it? So for me, the context of why we're still struggling today is because embedded in the history of this world, starting from, at least the construct was started from someone who was living in the United States, is this thought that there is a hierarchy of human beings, and that white people are at the top, and that Black people are at the bottom. And that those hierarchies go to their value, their intelligence, their abilities in so many different ways. How do you maintain that? Because it's false, right? We know it's false. I think they kind of might have thought it was false back then, because the brilliance of people of color didn't just reveal itself in 2022, right? So, but the false narrative that has become embedded in the bones of the whole world, really, the whole world, started with this guy sitting at his desk, and I think the book had a picture of him. So I don't want to really now that we don't know what the relative is, recreate. But it's true. I mean, I'm sitting there creating this hierarchy, and the hierarchy wasn't just white, Black, African, or what. It was qualities, and it's been bought. But why? Why is it? And we know fundamentally, why do we need to feel better than somebody else? What is it about white people, but it could have been somebody else, it wasn't, so I'm not even going to go there, that would say that somehow I don't have to elevate myself above you. I can be equal with you, and I can do my best. But the hierarchy created the need to maintain it. To maintain it. The falsity, the falsehood, the lie. The lie that white people are superior to Black people, to other people of color. And the other side of the lie is that Black people are inferior. You see, the internalization of those messages is why we're going to have a panel on criminal justice, why we're going to have a panel on education, and why we have the destruction of not just Tulsa, but we're talking about Tulsa, why we had the destruction of Tulsa. So the history is there, and the history is required. They had to defend it. They had to, I think your words, put us in our place. Because you can't have an obvious statement that we are all equal, or at least you ain't better or I ain't better. I have to respond to that. I've got to be violent. And embedded in that violence is not only the how dare you violence, not only the put you in the place violence, but it is the violence that says that somehow I have the right to kill you. I have the right to burn your community down. I have the right because you are less than. You are almost like an animal. See, part of, I think, the reason why they could do it, I don't want to say, I will go off track, but this is on track, but you know what I'm talking about, I'm going to say go off track. Think about it. Think about the fact that how do you enslave a people? How do you put them in chains? How do you deny them the right to speak their languages? How do you separate people from their tribes that they were in so they can't relate? How do you decide that you're going to beat me to death almost? Beat me because I dare to stand up for myself. Because how do you do that? First of all, you have to decide that I'm not human. And then once you realize that maybe that lie needs to be redone, I'm not human, I'm human, but less than. I'm childlike. That's why the face, the smiling face that the dean talked about that they wanted with the thing. They wanted this happy Negro, right? The lie that somehow we are either all happy and jovial, or we're criminals and rapists and women with sluts, all of those things. So you had to, see, once they created the lie, they had to defend the lie. You see what I'm saying? Once you create, it's almost like a kid. When a kid lies, then they're lying because they got to keep going, and they build another story to support that story. And, at some point, you just got to say, stop, hold it. But we can't do that. Our stop and hold it is another reason for the violence. So that's why, and we've got scholars that are attesting to the overvaluing of whiteness. We've got scholarship on that. We know it's a lie. The whole bell curve thing, all of that. You kind of knew in your gut, and I'm sure our ancestors did, because those who had to fight the bell curve, most of them are gone. But they kind of knew in your gut that it was wrong. But you had to fight it. You had to argue. Whole systems were built on our inferiority. So here we are, the born of the devaluation, the denial of equality, and the violence to maintain that. It was essential that, in fact, in Tulsa, the whites strike back. And we know the narrative, all of us have heard it, that, and Suzette mentioned it, that anytime a white woman says that a black man has even looked at her crossways, looked at her crossways, that's grounds for what? Murder. But they don't call it murder. They just call it protecting their women, white women. Right? So here we have in Tulsa this whole scenario that cries forth, and it's an example of white supremacist thought, white supremacist perspective. The cradle and the context for all of this is white supremacy in the United States. And it's worldwide, but I know the United States, right? So here we have, what did they have to do to create it, to maintain the myth, because we know it's a myth, right? They had to have forced segregation. It wasn't just in Tulsa, it's all over the country, forced segregation. They had to be, sort of like when they were forcibly segregated, and we have this whole history in our complaint. Well, I participated in the drafting of it's not our complaint, their complaint now, because I'm not lived here anymore. The complaint in the second lawsuit talks about that history, talks about the formation of the Greenwood district. What did they do? Forced segregation. What do we do? And I don't want to be too racialized and say only our people, but we bloom where we're planted. And that's what they did. They bloomed where they were planted. And Tulsa Greenwood district became nationally known. There were black people from all over the country going there and staying in the hotel. All the hotels. That was where they were going for a great time. Movie theaters, barbershops, beauty, all you can imagine. It was a city within itself. They did not have to go into Greater Tulsa. Only reason they went into Greater Tulsa was what? Because some of them worked in Greater Tulsa. How dare you? So white girl, white woman, I don't know how old she was, but let's say woman, falsely alleges that a black man, Roland, touched her in some unseemly way. She later retracted it, so we want to put that in the record. She later retracted it. And then he was an elevator operator. No, he was an elevator operator. They go and they get him and they put him in the jail. Suzette told you about the history of lynchings in Oklahoma. None had taken place yet in Tulsa. What happens? The black veterans from World War I got together and they went to the jail to protect him. The sheriff said, I got it. So okay, you got it. We'll go back. A white mob goes, because and the paper has made this whole story like it's true. And white mob goes to get him. The veterans go back. White supremacy said, how dare you? White supremacy says you're not supposed to come to defend him. There was an argument, disagreement, you know, more than that probably, and I think one of the people had a gun, more than one. They had guns, but they wanted to disarm the Black people, right? All hell broke loose, a shot fired, all hell broke loose, and the white mob went into Greenwood, followed by the Blacks who could not stop them, who didn't have enough. The destruction of Tulsa's Greenwood district lies at the feet, not just of Oklahoma, but at the feet of a country who would dare embrace racial hierarchy and diminishing values of people. It lies at those feet. And it is not until we can uproot it, expose it, at least educate people, be willing to educate people of the horrendousness of this context. We will not end this. We will not end this. I want to read really quickly from Stamped from the Beginning. And the author of Stamped from the Beginning, who's he talks about this, and he says that Stamped from the Beginning comes from a speech that Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis gave on the floor of the US Senate on April 12, 1860. The future president of the Confederacy objected to a bill funding Black education in Washington, D.C. This government was not found, this is a quote, this government was not founded by Negroes nor for Negroes, but by white men for white men. This is the foundation of this country. And this is the basis, the context, the cradle within which racism has started and racism continues. Thank you very much.
I was going to deliver my remarks sitting down, but where Adjoa leads, I feel I must follow. So, as so often before. Part of what I want to do is follow Adjoa's example by acknowledging the people who are continuing to work on this litigation. And we have one in the room, Angela Garcia, who's part of our legal team and who has been doing incredible work with us. She was down working past the midnight hour, helping us prepare for our oral arguments in September in the litigation. And another Coloradan who I don't think is here is Spencer Bryan, who in many ways came up with the public nuisance idea that that we've been working on ever since. So I thought what I would do is give you a quick overview of where we are now, and then talk a little bit about the public nuisance and unjust enrichment litigation in a little bit more detail. But we are engaged in a broad set of litigative and legislative efforts that include, among other things, congressional testimony by the three still living survivors of the Tulsa race massacre, who are now 101, Mr. Hughes Van Alice, 107, Leslie Randall, and 107, Ms. Viola Fletcher, all three of whom appeared, two of them in person, in DC in 2021 to give congressional testimony. I was privileged to be there. It was an amazing occasion. We are currently petitioning the Department of Justice, the Federal Department of Justice, to open a criminal investigation under the aegis of the Emmett Till Cold Case Act of 2007. And Dean Innes has submitted an affidavit in support of that effort because she is a descendant of victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre herself and has some incredibly important information about the mass graves in Tulsa, which you've been reading about mass graves in the Ukraine. There are mass graves in Tulsa, and there is no outrage over those. We have filed an updated version of the Tulsa Act that Suzette was just talking about. I helped work on and was proposed by Congressman Hank Johnson. Has been much movement on that. There are a variety of other still to be deployed legal strategies that I can't really talk about. And a huge amount of community activism on the ground in Tulsa. And so while when we were there first time round, the community activism was somewhat limited. It was mainly Eddie Fay Gates, who was, as Suzette mentioned, a historian whose main focus was finding and shepherding the then living survivors of the massacre. Now, our major leader on the ground is Dr. Tiffany Crutcher, who some of you may know because of her activism. Her brother was the victim of a police assassination, shot in the back. And so while she's doing work at the national level, advocating for police reform, including getting rid of qualified immunity, she's been doing a lot of work at the local level, advocating on behalf of the victims, the survivors and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre, as well as the residents of North Greenwood, the current Black community in Tulsa. And this second go-round has been somewhat different from the first go-round, because the first go-round we were focused primarily on the 135 survivors, from I just spaced his first name, Alexander, do you remember his first name? Yeah, to Wes Young. Wes Young I remember particularly well because when I was drafting the complaint, Wes Young was the last one, and so I always knew I was done adding to the list of the survivors when I came to Wes Young's name. So we were focused on them, but now we're focused a lot more on the whole community. And what has really convinced me, or has been a real change in the way that I perceive the massacre is that when you start focusing on the community, you realize that what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, while unique in its scope, in its scale, was not unique in its focus, and it's a totalizing system of anti-Black terror. There's currently a deep investment in maintaining, but as poet Dominic Christina told us last night, also manicuring and reselling that system to make it palatable for contemporary society, including and especially in Oklahoma. And our public nuisance and unjust enrichment litigation seeks to upset that narrative. Public nuisance has no statute of limitations, but is primarily seeking what you might think of as injunctive relief, or what in the lingo of public nuisance is called abatement. The essence of a public nuisance claim is that the actions of the, in this case, City of Tulsa, its Chamber of Commerce, its development agency, among others, through their actions during and after the massacre, have damaged the property, health, and security of the Black residents of Greenwood and North Tulsa. And the damages to be abated include the destruction of, among other things, the hospital during the massacre, the subsequent sanitation of Greenwood and North Tulsa, policing that imperils the health and safety of the community, and the splitting of the community by driving a freeway through the middle of it in the 1970s. So we're essentially seeking to abate each of these nuisances. We're also seeking financial compensation under the 3-year statute of limitations under an unjust enrichment theory for the misuse of the survivors' and descendants' history by the City of Tulsa and its Chamber of Commerce, who even as recently as 2021 sent up a Centennial Commemoration Commission that falsely claimed to be supported by the survivors. These misrepresentations of the survivors and descendants' support that continue by the City and Chamber of Commerce are part of their attempt to continue to tell the public story of the massacre in 2022 from their white-dominated perspective, just as they did in 1922 when they initiated their conspiracy of silence, which was so successful that DeMario, the lead attorney, who isn't a descendant but is a longtime resident of North Tulsa, so the non-descendant longtime residents of North Tulsa had no idea that the massacre happened, and in fact, when his historian professor at the University of Oklahoma told him about it, he thought he was lying. So, the scale of the silencing was massive, and we can talk a little bit about that in the question and answer. But the scale of the financial scam being run by the City of Tulsa and its organizations is quite massive as well. So the City, and just to give you a sense, the City and Chamber, through its Race Massacre Commission, has raised $30 million. So I'll repeat that, $30 million, which it's only willing to spend on a bunch of buildings. And the person in charge of the Greenwood Rising building that they're claiming commemorates the massacre has expressly said that he thinks that that's reparations and that monetary reparations to the survivors and descendants will not be paid. So they paid $30 million, $20 million have gone in the Greenwood Rising building, and not a red cent has gone from the commission to the 3 living survivors or any of the descendants in around the country or in North Tulsa. Instead, the goal of the current commission, City and Chamber, is to turn Greenwood, the place where the massacre happened, into a racial theme park that, as far as possible, whitewashes the massacre by refusing to account for the white perpetrators of racial terrorism. And so while I strongly honor the stories of the survivors, and we haven't told enough of their stories, and we haven't told enough of the stories of the descendants spread not only across the country to Los Angeles and Chicago and New York, but also internationally. So we had a survivor who sadly died just before we filed suit in Paris. While we ought to be focusing on their stories, as Monica Bell recently discussed in an article in Just Security, and I kind of picked it up myself, by failing to tell the stories of the people who perpetrated the riot, by just calling them a white mob, they remain faceless and unaccountable. And we know who they are. As you saw, actually, let's lift up our fellow scholars. So, in Suzette's latest article, she has pictures, but these pictures undersell just how many pictures there are of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Pictures that look eerily similar to the press that we're seeing out of Ukraine, with white folks parking their cars in the 10s and 20s, getting ready for a massacre, with proud white citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma, posing with their shotguns and their rifles and their revolvers, with the State National Guard driving their machine gun into Tulsa, the machine gun that was the reason why the Black Defense ultimately failed, because although the First World War and Mexican-American War veterans had adopted, don't forget Peg Leg Jackson, had adopted important defensive positions, they were finally overwhelmed, as we discovered, by the state National Guard, something that the state of Oklahoma had consistently denied. Another innovation in the 2003 litigation was that we were the first people to lift up and place on the record the fact that local businesses, Sinclair Oil, aircraft were used in the first aerial bombing on American soil. So bombs were dropped on Tulsa, Molotov cocktails, from the air in 1921. President Biden acknowledged that at the centennial, but I remember we had a long discussion with Al Brophy and the survivors about whether that really happened. And I think one of the important things that lawyers add is you believe your clients when they give you credible evidence, eyewitness evidence of things that happened. So, so the big difference, I think, between 2003 and 2022 is when we left in I think my last visit to Tulsa was around about 2005. When we left, I think it was with Adjoa and Charles Ogletree and Michelle Roberts, who should also get mentioned, who's now working for the NBA Players Association. Is directed the NBA Players Association, sorry. I don't know our full title, so, you know. One of the business people in Tulsa said, you know, you're leaving, what are you going to do for us? What we need is help on the ground. And I had no answer because a Section 1983 lawsuit only helps the living named people get a cash payment. But the current public nuisance litigation is by necessity, because of the way that public nuisance is framed, focused on the community and the neighborhood. And so our theories of who deserves benefits include, and this is important in the current reparations debate, the survivors, the descendants of the victims, but also everyone affected by subsequent racist oppression in the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which means the current residents of Greenwood and North Tulsa, so long as they've lived there for a certain period of time. We put in a sort of time period. So not just descendants, but all victims, all Black victims of the continuing acts of totalizing racist oppression in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I'll close, because I'm probably over time, by saying the history, and you can tell from my accent that I'm not a native of Tulsa. I think one of the things that that people who are unfamiliar with the history of Black America, but even people who are familiar with the history of Black America, underestimate is the extent to which violence is core to the experience of Black Americans. So if you're a Black American, you don't have to go back too far in your family history, if you need to go back at all, to tell a story about anti-Black violence and terror, because that's the core of the Black American experience. It's a core that James Baldwin called an unnameable subject. But so long as we continue not to talk about the core experience of Black America, so long as we try to make white people comfortable and pitch our reparations to white folks for a handout, then we're going to deeply underestimate the nature of the Black experience in America. And to the extent that we continue to hum the tune of, in this case, the city of Tulsa, and the way that they want to represent the massacre, we significantly misrepresent both the nature of the massacre and the resilience of those communities that still live with that system of totalizing anti-Black racism.
Everybody don't leave. I'm used to that at church. Good morning still. I am Robert Turner, grateful to be here, thankful to the University of Colorado School of Law, definitely grateful to Professor Malveaux, who I've been a fan of since I was 21. I'll never forget, as a professor at law school, Alabama, everybody wanted to take her class. Like everybody wanted to get in her class. And she only took a select few, and it's a privilege to be here. And also, while I was at Alabama, having the honor to meet Al Brophy, who I hope you keep in prayers for his health as well. I am not originally from Tulsa. I born and raised in Tuskegee, Alabama, right? Born on campus in John Andrew Hospital, which was the first and last predominantly Black hospital, Black-ran hospital in the state. And from 1932 to 1972, in the hospital I was born in, the United States government administered the Tuskegee syphilis study. The same hospital, right? The studies started in 1932 and ended in 1972, not because the Department of Health and Human Services grew a conscience. It was because somebody leaked it to the Washington Post. Otherwise, it arguably could still be going on today, right? The study ended in November of 1972. 10 years later, less than 10 years later, in July 1982, I was born. I turned 40 in a few months, so y'all pray for me. I have a bucket list for my 30s. I'm still trying to figure out what am I going to do. I want to go indoor skydiving. I thought about jumping out of an airplane, but I'm not ready for that. I may do that by the 50th birthday. I'm not getting a tattoo. I'm gonna do something crazy before I turn 40. So less than 10 years later, I was born, and growing up in Tuskegee, seeing the oaks where Booker T. Washington lived, and George Washington Carver's research, living a minute from Moulton Field with Tuskegee Airmen learning to fly, the birthplace of Rosa Parks, driving by Lionel Richie's home house when he grew up. You just fall in love with Black history, right? Knowing about Gamillion versus Lightfoot, the lawsuit, the case that addressed gerrymandering in America, that was based out of Tuskegee. And being in the AME church, right? My dad saw fit to name me. My full name is Robert Richard Allen Turner. If you know anything about Black church history, Richard Allen is the name of the first Black bishop in America, right? And my dad named me that before I knew who I was. So I was kind of marked from birth. I can't be like, you can't have a name of a bishop and be an atheist, right? That's like against the law. You know, like your first name is Christian and you're an agnostic. Really, that just makes sense. Never met a Christian that was an agnostic person named Christian. But anyway, so having this dynamic, right? Church, faith, history, social justice, activism. Went to University of Alabama, found out from Professor Brophy's law research, they had slaves buried on campus, right? Jack and Boise. And they had them in unmarked graves because at the time, when you are a professor, whatever your salary was, you got that plus fringe benefits. And in 1820s, 1830s, the fringe benefit was slaves. And when the slaves died, they were like, you know how you have a car, a campus car, you discard the car in the campus junkyard. You discard the slaves in whatever cemetery you can find on campus, right? And that's what they did. So I've been an activist pretty much all my adult life. And in ministry, going to Tulsa in 2017, I never forget it. It was not seen as a good promotion for me. In fact, good to see another Emmy pastor here, Dr. Timothy Tyler, God bless you, from Denver. It was not a plum appointment. People thought I had done something wrong to get assigned to Vernon in Tulsa. In fact, I committed to go to the bishop not knowing where I was going. I never forget it. I never forget. I was asleep. I was saying my evening prayers, and I had a feeling in my soul that God was doing something. And I said, Lord, I don't know what you're up to. I don't know what you're doing and asking of me to do in my life. I just want you to know, whatever it is, wherever it is, tonight I say yes. I end my prayer, in Jesus' name I pray, amen. I get off my knees, I reach for my cell phone to put it on the charger. As I'm reaching for my cell phone and to see what time it is, I noticed I had a text message. Text message read, I have an opportunity for you in my district. This was the bishop, Bishop Mitchell. Would you come? I just finished praying like 2 seconds earlier. I said yes. Didn't know where I was going to know. I said to whatever and wherever. And so I just text back yes, right? And I committed to go. I didn't find out where I was. So I leave my home in Alabama, kids going to a great school, living in the suburbs of Birmingham. I leave there to go to a place where I didn't even know how much money I was getting paid. I didn't find that out till I got my first check after I finished preaching, right? So I'll go to Tulsa, knew about Black Wall Street from Al Brophy and my professors at Alabama, and find out about this church that I'm pastoring, right, in Vernon. And Vernon sits still on Greenwood, oldest continuous black landowner, black or white in the whole entire Greenwood district. Nobody's owned that. We've owned our land since 1908. Nobody's owned the same parcel of land as long as we have. Then seeing the names on the stained glass windows of folks who, after the massacre, helped rebuild our sanctuary. The basement survived, but the sanctuary was destroyed on top. And finding some strange feeling of like the presence of others every time I went to the church. Like I could feel ancestors, right? Like I felt that they were really there and watching. And it's a very, if you've never felt that kind of stuff, it's, as a pastor now, I kind of get used to it. But it was a feeling that moved me. I mean, I feel it often, but that feeling moved me. It was like they were beckoning, so to speak. And I couldn't rest, right? I had to do something. I was like, Lord, I don't know what it is, but I feel like I got to do something about this situation, doing more research and finding out it was not resolved. I knew about the lawsuit in the early 2000s. And when I got to Tulsa, they were focused on like police brutality, because that was during the time where, you know, Eric Garner, there was a time with Trayvon Martin, there was a time, you know, Terrence Crutcher and all those. So everyone was focused on, and rightly so, police brutality. But God was like, this issue has still not been resolved. And I heard from him, and I still felt the presence of folks, right? And I couldn't shake. And one day I just said, Lord, okay, I will. And I found out, because I like going to city council meetings, and I found out that the city of Tulsa has city council meetings on Wednesday, which is in the church is the same day we have Bible study, right? Which is a direct affront to church folk. And then I found out they put it on Wednesday night to keep folk who look like me from showing up, because they know if we had to choose between city council meeting, a Bible study, they ain't even a choice. We're going to Bible study. And so God led me to take it to them, right? And then I mentioned it to one of the city fathers, in fact, Reverend Joey Crutcher. I told him about what I felt that God was wanting me to do. He was like, I've been trying to get some pastor in this city for years to do that. And I said, Lord, I would do this only if you give me a bullhorn, because I got to preach on Sunday, and I preach hard. I'm not going to lose my voice out on the streets of Tulsa. And so lo and behold, one day, not even me asking, I come into my office and I see a black bullhorn on my desk. Honest to God. And so I'll never forget, September the 12th, 2018, I was in Tulsa for a little over a year. I go out to City Hall. Prior to the week 2 leading up, I'm talking to other people, trying to get somebody to come and stand with me, right? You know, will you come and stand with me? Everybody claimed they believe in 1921, they support reparations and all this, but trying to get folks to come and stand with you is a totally different thing. People will tweet all day long. People will buy a t-shirt all day long. They will hashtag all, but when you ask folks to come and physically stand with you, you get crickets. So the first time I went out there, it was just me, my Bible, and bullhorn. But when I tell you those same ancestors that I felt on Greenwood, I felt as I was walking out of my car. I thought about turning around and said, you know what, I can't get in the back of my head. We're gonna go home. And then I heard the audible voice of God say, Robert, I'm with you. And I got out of my car and I stood at that post. I stood there for the remaining 3 years. Became one of the longest continuous reparation protests in the country. Petition that we had on change.org, over 30,000 signatures, one of the largest reparation petitions in the country. And after 2018, the momentum shifted. The words used, which matter, words matter. They ceased calling it the Tulsa Race Riot. And they started calling it the Tulsa Race Massacre after 2018. That same month before, the same following month in October 2018, community town hall meeting. The mayor of Tulsa comes to a community town hall meeting and he begins to talk about what he has done for the good people in North Tulsa, black folk. And everybody's complaining about good issues, drugs, potholes, schools, all that stuff, right? I stand, and this room is filled with politicians, community activists, community leaders, all of that stuff. And I'm not from here, right? I'm not from here. So I'm like, in the Washington Post, just that same day, printed an article of the city council president, powerful sister, Vanessa Hall Harper, and Christy Williams, powerful sister, and the Tulsa mass grave, right? And nobody in that meeting asked the man a question about what was on the front cover of the Washington Post. Nobody. We in the room with the man. But we don't want to talk about potholes and stuff like that, right? And so I said, Lord, I'm just getting here. I'm not from here. Folks can call me an outsider. I don't want to be the one to ask that question. I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that. I was that person at UA. I was a person in Alabama. I don't want to do that here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so I was waiting because I know I'm not the only person that reads the Washington Post, right? Pretty popular newspaper, I believe. And I'm in the room telling other folks, hey man, y'all see this? Somebody should ask the question. And I'm not gonna even tell y'all that some of the folks who were in there that I mentioned it to, who supposed to be real like radical and whatever. Well, you know, I'm not touching that. I'm not gonna talk about that. Really? Okay, well, okay. So, Lord, I said, I made a deal with God. See how this works out. I said, God, if nobody else asks a question, then I will. And then go through the whole meeting. Moderator says one last question. I raise my hand reluctantly, and I stand up, and the mayor's my first time speaking, mayor, the new pastor at Vernon, and I introduce myself, And I talk about, first thing comes out of my mouth, because I know he's seen me outside his office. I'm in City Hall. Reparations. Reparations. That was before in the documentary, before in the lawsuit. I'm going straight to the source. What are you going to do about reparations? And this Washington Post article just came out. These mass graves. Will you excavate? And the mayor, for the first time, came out publicly supporting the mass grave excavation. And people didn't know who I was. And I say all that to say this, and I'm gonna take my seat. And people think that oftentimes, our community has to be united in order to get anything done. And that's simply never been the case, ever. For any community, let alone ours, right? We weren't united on the continent of Africa. We had so many tribes, it's ridiculous. We did. We weren't united on the plantation. Some folk wanted to run away. Some folks wanted to stay. Some folks say, "Master, good to us." And even when they ran away, they disagreed on where they wanted to go. Some wanted to go to Canada. Some wanted to stay in the North. And in the civil rights movement with Booker T and W.E.B., God knows they disagreed. Malcolm and Martin, God knows they disagreed. SNCC and MLK disagreed, right? And in Tulsa, the same, without any exception. But that doesn't mean you can't get things done. Don't let consensus be the enemy of progress. Don't let unanimity be the obstacle or the major impediment for success. Because sometimes folks don't support for various reasons. 3 years later, we've had the world come watch this preacher who's not from Tulsa sit and stand in the rain, sleet, hail, and snow. Jesse Jackson came right before I left and stood. And so what people are not willing to do with you today, God will send somebody to do with you tomorrow. Faith is part of what I'm here to talk about, the role of. It has encouraged us, even in the worst of times. It moves us forward when we feel like sitting down. It encourages us when nobody else does. Gets you out the bed when you're tired. Dries your tears when you're weeping. Gives you joy in your heart when you're mourning. Faith is what allowed the survivors to come back to Vernon that following Sunday after the massacre. And I believe faith will continue to lead us home. Thank you all.
So, okay. So anybody from the audience who has questions, do I have a student who will go ahead and take those for me? And then those who are participating remotely have an opportunity to go ahead and post questions in the Q&A. So, so at this time, we'll take questions. Is one of the students available? Thank you. Okay, great. Okay. 4 minutes for questions. Yeah. We have 5 minutes for questions. I'm not going to do it.
Thank you all so much for your very, very important work. I was so inspired by this conversation. And I just wanted to ask a question about how you perceive the politics in Tulsa. I think picking up a little bit on what Reverend Turner was just saying about division, I was thinking about, like Senator Kevin Matthews, like a Black man from Tulsa, was leading the Centennial Commission and advocating what Eric called the racial theme park, which I think is really accurate. And I guess if you could tell us a little bit more about on the ground, what's going on in terms of advocacy for reparations, for like the quote cultural tourism, for like all the different bundles of types of responses to elevate Greenwood and North Tulsa.
I can speak to that. I know Senator Matthews well, and I think I'm happy you asked that question because one thing that gets missed in all of this is that you have a Black man in an overwhelmingly predominantly white state. Black folks make up 12% of the population of Oklahoma. Black man organized this commission. At the time, we were just supposed to have a Greenwood Culture Center. And under his leadership, raised $30 million from private funds, right? Private and some public funds. And I and a few others were a part of the visioning process. And one of the things that we wanted to make sure of, and what I explicitly stated, that this should not be Disney World when folks come to this, whatever you call it, because I think they can't call it a museum because they don't have the historical archives in it. And that it should be very much so palpable, where you feel the history of it. And he's a state senator. Now, they know that I know and how I feel that that's not reparations, right? It's just not. And I think anybody who's honest must admit that it's not true reparations. But they are not the city of Tulsa. They're not the state of Oklahoma. The burden and the onus is on the folk who were actually there, who didn't put out one file like the fire department, who didn't make one arrest like the police department. And we have evidence that the people who had the pictures from the massacre, I asked about this at the mass grave meeting, the police department said they can't find the pictures. How is the agency charged with collecting evidence, the one that loses evidence? And we got businesses like St. Clair Oil, where the airplanes were owned by, that were flown, right? They have been quiet as a house mouse these last 3 years. And every chance I get and got, I would call their names out. And I would never spend a penny over at their facilities or their place of business. And so I think that there is some soreness there on the fact that, hey, you got something raised, right? And I get it. I mean, you got something raised versus the city who, and the state who is not trying to give anything, right? But who should be. And so instead of like being state, city, pay, and businesses who profited, pay, we got this money and we want you to give it. We see y'all got this money, y'all should give it. And so that's the role, that's the dynamic. And but I'm happy you mentioned that, because that is something by itself, big man, because he is the head of that. He was the head of that commission. It's no longer in function now.
You mind?
No, Eric.
So it's a great question. I think we're seeing in a variety of ways, and I want to point to the Georgetown 272. There's a big split there between Georgetown-run public relations program that is investing some money in, again, memorials and buildings, but is refusing to give a single cent to the survivors of, or the descendants of the enslaved people. And there is a big legal move, and Adjoa knows more than this than I do, but I just want to frame it this way, by many of the descendants to get monetary and other significant substantial reparations that will make a difference to their lives on the ground. So we got a university-style memorial versus actual investment in the lives of the people on the ground. In Tulsa, we have a commission that, by the way, is supported by the city of Tulsa and is heavily supported by the Chamber of Commerce. Two of the institutions that were front and center in the race massacre and its aftermath, raising money so it's the behemoth in the fundraising ability of other people who want to raise money to give to the survivors, people think, no, we give it, here's the big institution that's raised $30 million. Again, $30 million, 20 million of which has gone to one building, and the director of which has said no monetary payments to the descendants and the other victims of Tulsa racism. And so that fundraising apparatus takes away the ability to effectively raise money. They said that the survivors, in 2021 during the commission, they said that the survivors supported them. The survivors had to come out and run a public relations campaign to point out that they didn't support them. John Legend thought when he was going to the commission celebration that he was going to a celebration endorsed by the survivors. When he found that out, he pulled out. So did many members of the Congressional Black Caucus. So there's a major rift in Tulsa at the moment between individuals who support symbolism. And the Tulsa City Council has recently made some symbolic statements about reparations, but they can't raise the money for that. They're not going to get the money for that. Versus the rest of us who are creating a descendants community. So we are reaching out in Justice for Greenwood. We have a whole descendants memorialization project in which we're going out and getting testimony from descendants about their inheritance. Dean Innes, I think, has agreed to be part of that. That is reaching out to significant community leaders who are still there and still on the ground and still doing activism, and are trying to ensure that the Greenwood Rising Project doesn't take survivors and descendants' memorabilia without compensating them and misuse it as part of their whitewashing project. And I'll finish with this before I hand over to Adjoa. When I walked through Greenwood on my way to the commemoration in 2021, I walked past a ballpark. And if you know anything about the history of the Tulsa Race Massacre, you'll know that the victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre were rounded up and placed in a ballpark where the sign on the ballpark, which is sponsored by Sinclair Oil, is so the city of Tulsa and its commemoration folks have allowed this to be created as part of the businesses that are supposed to help Black people. Sinclair Oil has a picture of an airplane flying, as part of the commemoration. So Sinclair Oil, who dropped bombs on Tulsans, has its own ballpark with its airplane logo there. So there's certainly room for division in all of this, but who's fighting the good fight is something to talk about.
Okay, and I'm going to give Adjoa the last word on this question, and then also a question that we got online regarding the requested remedies for the public nuisance claim. So Adjoa, if you want to weave that into your answer to the prior one. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and Eric probably has a better memory. We created, I was the lead in the part of the lawsuit where we created the remedies for the nuisance. And part of those remedies were funds should be developed for homeowners to get monies to prepare their homes, health, issues around health, those things, so that the nuisance that was caused, that impacted, like Greenwood had a hospital, it was destroyed. Schools, they were destroyed. So those were the kind of funds we felt should be in there to create ways in which people could get monies to repair their homes and that. One of the things I wanted to say in part of when I was presenting, I understand Reverend Turner wants to keep the focus on the city of Tulsa, but the person who is the head of that commission who formed it also kept people in, and we have that in our complaint, that he refused to acknowledge and put on the commission initially any people who were in fact living in Greenwood and were descendants. Mm-hmm. It is, and we all know, and I used to be hesitant to raise this because, that's one smear against Black folk, but this is in every so-called race, right? I say so-called now because I learned back in 2004, the social construction. There are divisions. He led, and I don't know if he's still leading, a commission that totally undermined the movement for reparations for Greenwood. That is an undermining. And he appropriated, he and that group that was with him, misappropriated the images, and that's another thing we say in our complaint, the images and the stories of those prominent and non-prominent, but particularly prominent people in Tulsa that were murdered in this massacre. So we have to stop. We have to stop it. We have to stop having, oh, well, it's really the white folks that are, really the enemy. We become part of the enemy too because we join in that because of our own elevation, and that's what happened. I do want to raise, and we didn't say it formally, I don't think, that the dean is a descendant I don't know if your family died, but they destroyed their family's business, a mortuary in Tulsa. And part of what we know from that history, when they destroyed that, they didn't take Black bodies to the white mortuary.
Mm-hmm.
So, we just, for me, and I'm gonna shut up because I know we have other questions and you have time, but we can't not uplift people who are misappropriating just because their skin and leading that because their skin is like mine. It's not right. And we have to call that out because we're not gonna end white supremacy because this is another aspect of white supremacy. They allow white supremacy to continue because they are getting something from it. And we have to speak up, not just Black folks, white folks too. Green folks, we used to say this, I was gonna, whether they white, green, Black, or purple, or whatever. I mean, my mama had a whole list of colors. I ain't never seen no purple people, but so I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. We're going to take one more question. It looks like we have time. Oh, you got that? Okay. It's one of our illustrious alum.
Ms. Val Golightly Howe, and I am a graduate of this illustrious law school now going back 40 years, and also a member of the alumni board. What I wanted to share is that from the beginning of today's conference, I've been emotionally struck by a number of similarities that cross the spectrum of the speakers and myself, having grown up and been raised in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, just 2 blocks away from the university campus, being the younger sister of a brilliant woman who could not go to the university because of our skin color, as being someone whose parents were taxpayers and landowners for generations, and following my sister to the great Tuskegee Institute, where I received a phenomenal education, and my pride in being a Black person, a Black woman, was cemented at that university. What I wanted to say to you all and to whoever put this conference together is so sorely needed. And I wish it could be replicated across not just Colorado, but across the country, because you people have spoken truth to power. And you may not realize the threads, but everything you've said is so true. And with the beginning of talking about race as a social construct, what many don't realize is that a lot of so-called white people today weren't deemed white until there came a need to allow those who were not considered white to apply for whiteness. and become white because there were too many Black people having too many babies. And there was a fear that the Black population would outnumber and then become violent, use that violence against white people as they had been violated. So that's something that I always try to mention when I have an opportunity to speak. And like they say, never give a microphone to a lawyer, especially one who's been a trial attorney, because it's hard to put the mic down. But you all spoke truth to power. And one of the things about not being afraid to speak out, you might be the only one standing there, but you may be the only person in the room who has an opportunity to use your voice. And so it's critically important that we all use our voices. And then the last thing you said, just because we wear the same Black skin doesn't mean that we have the same motivations. And so we need to just be truthful about these things, because otherwise we are never, ever going to get beyond this fallacy of race. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank the panel for a beautiful job. We're going to take a break. Give yourself about 5-10 minute break, and then we're going to come back for our next panel, which is institutional complicity in U.S. slavery, the role of the judiciary and higher education.